As a former Aikido instructor, I've been training Aikido for over a decade, but I've never tried its sister martial art, Judo. I only heard stories of how someone who doesn't know Judo gets thrown around like a rag doll by an experienced Judoka, and what a thrilling experience that is. Hearing these stories, I always wanted to experience that feeling of being thrown around without any ability to resist. And as a lifelong martial artist, how can I call myself a serious martial artist if I never had that experience? Also, until you experience something directly, you can never be truly sure if what others are saying is true. And so I wanted to find out if the experience of being a ragdoll in Judo is true or not. On top of that, many of my channel viewers constantly asked me to try Judo out, so I decided that it was finally time to do it.
Yet getting to that point wasn't as easy as I thought.
Once I made the decision to finally try Judo, I searched online for Judo schools in my country, Lithuania, but the only ones I found had classes either for children or for experienced Judoka. I then asked myself,
how can I go to such a dojo if I'm neither a kid nor am I an experienced Judoka?
For a moment, I thought that trying out Judo anytime soon is out of the question. But then I decided that it's too early to give up and started exploring more options. I then realized that no one is holding me in my country and that I can travel to any Judo school in the world of my choice.
But of course, it's always an easier experience when there's someone around who you know that can guide you.
That's when I remembered Shadi, a fellow former Aikidoka from France who is now a devoted Judoka and is actively exploring Judo on his channel. I wrote to Shadi asking if he could welcome me to train together at some of the Judo classes he is attending, also checking if I could film while I'm there.
Turns out, organizing the filming wasn't an easy task.
Shadi had to write a number of emails and contact a handful of people to get permission for me to join the classes and film. But eventually, he managed to succeed, and as soon as I got a confirmation, I was on my way to Paris. I met Shadi next to the dojo, said hi, and then we entered the training hall.
But here, I saw something that I did not expect.
Being new to Judo, I was proudly wearing a white belt, but I did not expect to be the only white belt among dozens of Judo black belts and brown belts. In fact, there was a single yellow belt too, but he was as lost in the mix as I was. I then learned that this was the Olympic team, preparing for tournaments at the highest level.
On one hand, I was intimidated.
I was asking myself if I will be able to come back home in one piece. But on the other hand, at least I expected to definitely have the experience of being thrown around like a ragdoll. As the class started, even the warm-ups were super intense, featuring such exercises as pulling each other as we were walking, jumping over each other, and carrying one another while walking on our hands. And this warm-up lasted for a while. We then moved on to training some ground techniques, which made the class somewhat easier for me because of my experience training BJJ. But then we moved on to standing grappling, in Judo known as randori.
I thought finally I'm going to experience being thrown around like a ragdoll, the experience I was looking forward to.
Yet, during my sparring with Shadi, I didn't get that experience. The only thing that did stick with me was how many rules there were, and how I constantly kept learning that I was doing something illegal, like grabbing the opposite collar for too long.
Once my sparring with Shadi ended, I was puzzled but hopeful that maybe during my next sparring with a black belt, the experience would be different.
Yet, while I did experience a single moment of both of my legs being swept, where I completely lost touch to the ground and all control of my body, which did impress me and was exactly what I was looking for. Unfortunately, throughout the whole rest of the sparring, there were no more significant experiences of me being like a ragdoll. After a few more rounds of sparring, the situation did not change, and I left the class disappointed and confused. The next day, Shadi and I met for another Judo class, this time with more varied level practitioners. But now, I wasn't sure what to do anymore. I was having doubts that maybe I was doing something wrong. Maybe I resisted too much. The sparring this time started with ground grappling, which again was not very challenging for me, as I found myself surprised to do quite well as a BJJ blue belt against a Judo black belt. But then, when the time to do stand-up grappling came, I was so confused about my experience of the first class from yesterday that I decided to just not resist at all. As a result, various Judoka threw me a number of times, but I never really felt like I lost control. While the Judoka were nice to me, showing me some moves and allowing me to throw them sometimes, pretty much every time I was thrown, I felt that I could defend the takedown, but simply chose to give up instead. And that did not make me feel like a ragdoll, the experience I was looking for.
I came back home feeling disappointed, questioning my experience.
Then, I remembered various online discussions I've read about judo becoming watered down due to its focus on the sports element by constantly changing the rules and banning various techniques to promote the sport of judo.
That did not seem impossible to me, since as a BJJ practitioner, I see that potentially happening in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
With various competitors focusing so much on getting points during tournaments that they forget fundamental aspects of Jiu-Jitsu such as avoiding positions where someone could easily strike you or going down to sit on the ground way too quickly. I started wondering if maybe that watering down of judo was the reason why I did not get my experience that I was looking for. But learning the truth in martial arts is very important for me, and so I decided, instead of forming an opinion based on a single experience, to seek further for what is true. To find out if my experience was a result of judo becoming watered down, or if something else happened that I did not understand, I decided to contact someone who knows judo inside out. And that person was Shintaro Higashi, a professional judo instructor and former professional high-level judo competitor who trained across the whole globe and also has cross-training experience in BJJ, boxing, and other martial arts. I described to Shintaro my experience of not getting thrown around like a ragdoll, contrary to how I expected, and immediately he had a great insight.
If you're doing MMA, you have a nice base of not getting taken down, so you have nice body awareness, so you're not a complete beginner. Coupled that with the fact that you're a big guy, you're athletic, you have a nice foundation, and you're also wearing a white belt, the average judo practitioner is going to come up and be like, oh, this guy's a white belt, let me kind of take it easy and start 20-30%, and all of a sudden you're like, oh shoot, this guy's tough, he has a good foundation, let me increase the intensity little by little. 3 minutes in, 4 minutes in, time's up. It would not be fair if I'm going against a brand new beginner who's a white belt, never met him, and I just start laying into him. That's just not fair. So it's unfair to be like, hey, white belt versus black belt. It's not really the case, right? There's a lot of stuff happening beneath the layers.
That already made a lot of sense. As thinking about it, that's the exact same thing that would happen if I'd have to spar a beginner in BJJ or kickboxing. But then I wondered if maybe I was also a bad sparring partner, which made the situation even worse.
You were fully defensive. Anybody who decides to be very, very defensive, very difficult opponent always. So let's just say you have to beat that guy up over there, and we get somebody that's sort of relatively athletic. He has no experience. You have a lot of experience. Ready, go. And he decides to turn around and run away as fast as he can. And he could run faster than you. There's no fight. And I know that's an extreme example, but it's always on that side of a spectrum. You put someone who has little grappling skills, but instruct them, hey, just don't get choked. Or like, let's just say I'm in your close guard and all I do is just hug down and grab your belt and lock down and not try to do anything and keep a wide base. It's very difficult to submit that person.
I did feel guilty of being too defensive.
People can be like, hey, don't be so defensive, but do you have an offensive game? And if you don't, it's better off that you're defensive because at least then you're not getting slammed.
Becoming conscious of the element that I was only being defensive did shed even more light on the situation. But then I was still wondering, shouldn't an experienced judoka be able to throw around someone even if they were completely defensive? But here, Shintaro also had a great insight.
There's a specific methodology to encountering those people. If you look at the best guys in the world teaching judo, they're not teaching to throw defensive opponents most of the time because they're teaching high athletes to compete against other athletes who are offensive, playing the rules of judo. When you're a sensei long enough and doing judo long enough, you develop strategies for all sorts of positions, which you may not encounter in competition. Because in competition, if we bow and if I try to throw you and you have your hips back and you're locking up, they'll be like, okay, passive, penalty. Passive, you're disqualified, right? Because they penalize anything negative in judo. You're not actively trying to take the person down, slam him, and submit him.
In France, maybe that could have been one of the cases because I was defensive, and since that's the competitive team, maybe these people are not used to this random guy just sticking his arms out. And
probably. Probably they're thinking to themselves, if they're preparing for competition, okay, he's got one penalty, he's got two penalties. I force one more penalty, I win.
Realizing that many judoka preparing for high-level competitions don't train against people who are only defending made even more sense as to why maybe I didn't get my ragdoll experience. But here, my main question finally came up. If the sport element prevents many judoka from learning to deal with purely defensive opponents, does this confirm that judo is in fact becoming watered down due to its focus on the sports element?
Yet, as Shintaro explained, things are simply not that, well, simple.
You're thinking of judo as a sport versus a martial art, because those are completely different things. If you're looking at it from a martial arts perspective of, I want to be able to defend myself, now all of a sudden, doing no leg grabs and turtling in newaza and not having good groundwork, those things are all disadvantages. But if you're looking at growing the sport globally, on an Olympic stage, money flowing in, and it's an entire industry, then those rules are probably good because the person who's in charge of international judo now is basing all his decisions on data, and they're making it more spectator friendly. I believe teaching judo in a holistic way. It's like, I'm not teaching you guys to compete in the Olympics. If you want to do that, sure, I'll help you, but majority of my dojo students are hobbyists, like any place in the world that does grappling. With those people, it's like, hey, we're gonna take a overall holistic approach to this thing, and we're gonna do grappling style rules. It really depends on your journey. I think it's a responsibility of the instructor and responsibility for the instructors to kind of shape the room. If you're trying to train the Olympic team at a national training center, you have to do judo rules only. And if you're there, hey, I'm here for self-defense, it's like, okay, that's not what we do here. It has to be pretty clear.
And that's when it dawned on me.
Like many people, I have been thinking in a binary way. I wanted to decide whether the sports element of judo is watering judo down or not. But in reality, each judo school can decide by themselves whether they will focus on holistic judo that includes self-defense elements like in Shintaro's dojo, or if the dojo will mainly focus on the sports element.
And there is nothing wrong if it does focus on the sports element.
After all, such combat sports as boxing do not worry about including leg kicks or weapon defense, and it doesn't have to. But the difference here probably is that boxing is universally acknowledged and has a strong identity as a sport with specific rule sets. Meanwhile, judo is identified as a martial art, and that's where things become murky. Many people expect a martial art to be all-inclusive instead of focusing on sports. But in reality, as long as people who are teaching or training judo are clear whether they are training holistic judo or sports judo, there's no problem with that, as the sports element does what it has to do. It makes the competitions safer and more entertaining to watch, but it does not forbid anyone from training and teaching judo the way they want to train it. Now, if a judoka is completely closed from the idea of cross-training and learning other martial arts, that may be a problem.
But that's a whole different discussion.
Meanwhile, I came to judo to get thrown around like a ragdoll, but I ended up learning something much more important. I learned how important it is to not be judgmental, to not rely on first impressions, and to seek out the greater truth, since we can grow and find awesome discoveries if we do.
And regarding getting thrown around like a ragdoll,
now I know Shintaro, who has invited me over to train with him in New York, and the next time I visit the States, I'm sure that once I will see him, he will surely be able to give me a taste of the ragdoll experience that I was looking for. If you want to see my judo versus BJJ sparring, click here. If you want to see my full talk with Shintaro, click here. Thank you for watching, and as always, I wish you to own your journey.